Welcome back to Entity Framework Core Fundamentals. I'm Julie Lerman. In this module, we're going to respond to a change in the business rules for the publisher because the developers were recently sent this note from the editors. Dear programmers, we would like to keep track of the artists who design our book covers, and note that sometimes these artists collaborate on a cover. Thanks! Well, the dev team chatted about this and realized that in order to implement the change, they'll have to add a many-to-many relationship into their domain. And that's what we'll focus on in this module. EF Core has 3 ways to implement many-to-many relationships, but the most common and natural of them is referred to as skip navigations. And that's what we'll work with for the bulk of this module. You'll learn how to define skip navigations, query across many-to-many relationships, and build and remove relationships between objects. We'll also take a look at the circular references in relationship graphs. These existed in our one-to-many relationships, but now it's time to understand them more deeply and even take advantage of them. Then you'll get an introduction to the other ways to map many-to-many so that you're familiar with them if the need arises. As the publisher grows, they are having a harder time keeping track of all of the artists and the book covers that they design. So it's time to get those into the system. While the publisher doesn't have authors collaborating on book writing, they do have artists that collaborate on cover design. So because it's possible for one artist to work on many book jackets and possible for a book jacket to have multiple artists working on its design, in order to track this in our system, we'll need a many-to-many relationship. In EF Core, we have 4 ways to define many-to-many relationships. The most common leverages a pattern called skip navigations. In both ends of the relationship, you need only to have a collection or list property pointing to the other end. And this gives us the most natural way to work with a relationship like this. For more complex needs, there are other ways to map many-to-many in EF Core. One of those ways adds to the skip navigation by allowing the database to keep track of additional details about the relationship. And those additional details are referred to as payloads. The third way to define many-to-many is to just explicitly create an entity between the 2 ends that join them. This is trickier to work with, but it does let you have a lot more control over how much extra data you can retain about that relationship. And finally, for those of you who, like me, are designing your applications following domain-driven design guidance, you will be happy to know that EF Core also supports mapping unidirectional many-to-many relationships. While the many-to-many continues to exist in the database, you can use this when you really only need to navigate from one end of the relationship and avoid having to manage the side effects of the extraneous navigation. We'll mostly focus on the common and easiest to use skip navigations to implement our new business rule. But I will provide you with some high-level information about the other 2 methods so that you're at least aware of them as an option. And if the need appears, you can learn more about them at that point. Here's a high-level look at the steps we'll need to take for implementing a new many-to-many relationship in our application. First, we'll need to define our new classes, artist and cover. We'll need to make the DB context aware of these classes, and we'll do that by creating DB sets in the pub context. Then we'll need to update the database schema. So we'll need to first create a new migration and then apply it to the database. With that in place, we'll be able to start managing our artists and book covers, inserting, querying, and modifying that data as needed. And you might notice there's something still missing here. In the next module, we'll tie those book covers to the books for which they're being designed. Let's take a quick look at how skip navigations work, and then we'll go ahead and create our new many-to-many relationship. For simple many-to-many relationships, you only need to add properties in those related classes that point to each other. That means when we create the artist class, it will need a property that's a list of covers, and the cover class will need a property that's a list of artists. By convention, EF Core will interpret this into how a relational database expresses a many-to-many relationship. there'll be an artist's table, there'll be a covers table, and there will also be a join table in between that has foreign keys back to the artists and covers. This table will have a one-to-many relationship to the artist's table and a one-to-many relationship to the covers table. Then for every artist and cover connection, you'll have a new row in that join table. And what's nice about the skip navigations is that this complexity will all be invisible to you. You'll just be working with an artist's covers or with a cover's artists. And based on conversations with a publisher, here's how we've decided to define the artist and cover classes. Artist has its artist ID key property, their first name, their last name, and a list of the covers that they've worked on or are contracted to work on. The cover class has its cover ID, a string for capturing design ideas, a Boolean to note if the cover only needs to be for digital publications, and a list of the artists that are working on that design. And that list could be empty before any artists have been assigned. It could end up with only one artist, or it could have multiple artists in it. I've added these two classes into the domain project of the solution that we've been working with. I do need to make the context aware of them. And because I know I'll need to query and save artists directly sometimes, and that I'll also need to query and save covers directly sometimes, I'll create DB sets for both of these classes, artists and covers. Before creating a migration, let's see how the EF Core Power Tools visualizer tells me that EF Core will interpret this model. We haven't used this tool in a little while, so just as a reminder, you need to right-click on the Publisher Data project, choose EF Core Power Tools, and then add DB Context Diagram. And here are the new entities as far as the data model is concerned. It knows about the artist and the cover classes, and then it's inferred a third entity, which EF Core will interact with under the covers, artist cover, whose two properties are artists, artist ID, and covers, cover ID. EF Core convention named those properties based on the names of the primary keys in the entities that it's joining. And it is possible to override this naming and on-model creating if needed. Notice also that under the covers, EF Core doesn't actually recognize the direct relationship from artist to cover. In order to sync with the database, it's also inferring a one-to-many relationship between the artist and artist cover, where one artist can have multiple joins, and another relationship between cover and artist cover, and again, where cover can have multiple joins in the artist cover class. I'll go ahead and add the migration now, and I'll call it artist and cover. Notice that the migration is reminding me about that precision of the price column in the book table. It's not creating that again, it's just reminding me because when I created the migration, it read the whole thing and made note of that. Now, opening the migration file, here it's creating the new artists and covers tables, and there's nothing really interesting happening there. Oh, we haven't had a Boolean property before, so I guess I should point out that it knows how to map Booleans. And in SQL Server, that maps to a non-nullable bit data type. Now here's the logic for the many-to-many. As the visualizer prepared us for, EF Core recognized that I defined a many-to-many. And it's assuring that the join table gets created in the database. And it only has two columns, which you saw in the visualizer. Then it defines a composite primary key made up of the combination of these two ID columns. It expects that each row will have a unique combination. Then it also defines that each column is a foreign key connected to the relevant table. So artist's artist ID is connected to the artist ID primary key in the artist's table, and the same with the covers. Because these are both one-to-many relationships, here again we're seeing the default cascade delete so that if someone deletes an artist row, then any rows in artist cover for that artist will also be deleted, and the same for any deletes in the covers table. And finally, it's building just one index on the covers cover ID column. I asked about this, and Andres Ferid from the EF Core team explained why it's implemented that way. You'll find a link in the resources of this module to a GitHub issue where we had this conversation, as well as an article by Kimberly Tripp about the more general guidance around foreign keys on indexes in SQL Server. But you can always modify the migration file. So I'll go ahead and copy this create index method and fix up the new one to make sure that the database also has an index for the artist ID column. After I go back to migrations and call update database, here's the resulting schema after the changes were made to the database. And this looks similar to the data model. I happen to be using a diagram tool in SQL Server Management Studio, in case you were wondering. So with this mapping, you're finally witnessing another great benefit of EF Core's mapping capabilities. In my classes, I don't have to worry about managing the join between artists and cover. I just have my covers list in the artist class and my artists list in the cover class to work with. EF Core will take care of transforming queries and updates between the classes that are defined the way I want to work with them and the way it makes sense to persist them in a relational database.